It feels like every day there's some new international incident brewing, you know?
Yeah.
So today we're diving deep into a few events that you might have missed, but that have some really big implications.
Correct.
We're talking the war in Ukraine, tensions surrounding Greenland, and the escalating rhetoric between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Sounds good.
By the end of this deep dive, you'll not only know what happened, but also understand the why behind the headlines and what it could mean for the future.
It's interesting, isn't it, how these seemingly isolated events are actually all connected to a larger trend of rising global tension.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Sure.
Starting with the war in Ukraine. We can't ignore that recent tragedy in Zaporizhzhia where a Russian bombing killed at least 13 civilians.
Right.
And that number could even go higher.
Yeah.
Our sources are painting a really grim picture. They talk about bodies in the streets and emergency workers trying to save lives amidst burning cars. It's a stark reminder that this war is far from over.
Yeah, the human cost of this conflict is truly heartbreaking. And Russia's continued push to claim Ukrainian territory is a key factor. You know, the battle for control in areas like Kursk just keeps raging on. It's this constant back and forth.
Right. And Ukraine isn't just sitting back. They're launching counterattacks like that drone strike on the Russian oil depot.
Yeah, that strike was really significant strategically.
Yeah.
Because it targeted fuel for Russia's strategic bomber fleet, which could impact their ability to conduct long-range attacks.
Wow.
So think of it this way.
Yeah.
It's not just about taking out the fuel dump. It's about disrupting their entire chain of operations
Oh, wow. I see.
for Russia's air power.
So both sides are entrenched and neither one is backing down. Is a peaceful resolution even possible at this point?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's hard to be optimistic given the current situation, but we have to hope that diplomacy will eventually win out. I mean, the alternative is just too dire to even think about.
Yeah, it's pretty bleak. Speaking of territorial disputes, the situation in Greenland throws a whole new curveball into the mix.
Yeah.
Remember a while back when Donald Trump suggested taking Greenland by force?
Oh, yeah.
It sounds kind of crazy, right?
It does sound a little out there, doesn't it? But the reactions from European leaders were very real.
Right.
And it really highlights that anxiety about territorial integrity and the potential for aggression on the world stage.
Yeah. And it wasn't just a one-off comment from Trump either.
Right.
He has expressed interest in Greenland before, which adds another layer of intrigue, don't you think?
It definitely does.
Yeah.
Greenland might seem remote, but its location makes it incredibly valuable strategically. For example, during World War II, the U.S. built air bases there to counter Nazi expansion. And today, with melting ice opening up new shipping routes and access to resources, it's become a focal point for countries like Russia and China as well.
So beyond the initial shock value, what are the underlying concerns here? What are European leaders worried about?
Well, the principle of border inviolability is paramount. You know, the idea that a powerful nation could just seize territory from another country.
Right.
That sets a very dangerous precedent. And this isn't just about Greenland itself. It's about the potential for a domino effect, where other nations might feel emboldened to make similar moves.
So how does this tie into the bigger picture of NATO,
Yeah.
U.S.-European relations, and the Arctic region?
Well, if the U.S. were to actually act on this idea, which is, highly unlikely, but if they did, it would shatter trust with their European allies. It could weaken NATO and embolden other countries with territorial ambitions. It could also trigger a scramble for resources in the Arctic, which would turn that fragile region into a hotbed of competition and possibly even conflict.
Wow, okay. So we've got simmering tension over resources and territory. It makes you wonder if this could signal a shift in how nations view territorial claims in an increasingly resource-scarce world.
Yeah, the definite possibility. As resources become more scarce and competition intensifies, we may see a shift away from the rules-based international order that has, for the most part, kept things relatively stable since World War II. Nations might start flexing their muscles more, leading to increased tensions and possibly even conflict.
Let's shift gears now to the escalating rhetoric between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Okay.
This conflict has been simmering for decades, but recent events have really turned up the heat.
Yeah.
The history of conflict between these two countries over the Nagorno-Karabakh region is deeply rooted, and we've actually seen full-blown wars erupt there in the past. This recent flare-up of tensions is particularly concerning given the language being used.
Yeah, the rhetoric is very inflammatory.
The inflammatory language used by Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev, specifically calling Armenia a fascist state that needs to be destroyed, is deeply concerning.
Yeah, words have power, especially in a region with such a fraught history. Aliyev using the term fascist evokes memories of past atrocities, including genocide. And it can be seen as a deliberate attempt to dehumanize Armenians and justify violence against them.
I understand the concerns about Aliyev's rhetoric, but could there be an element of Armenia using this situation to garner international sympathy? I mean, how do we navigate that complexity?
It's a valid point. Accusations of playing the victim card often surface in these kinds of protracted conflicts, and disentangling genuine fears from political maneuvering is crucial for any meaningful analysis. However, dismissing Aliyev's rhetoric as just posturing would be a mistake. I mean, the historical context is just too heavy, the potential consequences too dire.
And it's not just talk. Azerbaijan's actions on the ground, especially in trying to assert control over Nagorno-Karabakh, have displaced thousands of ethnic Armenians.
Right. The situation in Nagorno-Karabakh remains a powder keg. Both sides accuse each other of violating ceasefire agreements, and the lack of progress in peace negotiations only makes things worse.
Armenia has expressed concern over Aliyev's statements, but they've also reiterated their commitment to a peaceful resolution. However, is diplomacy even feasible in this environment, especially when one side is using such inflammatory language?
That's the key question, isn't it? The rhetoric is poisoning the well, making it incredibly difficult to build trust and find any common ground. And then you add in the strategic importance of the Zengezur corridor. This is a vital transportation route that connects Azerbaijan to its enclave of Nakhchivan and its ally Turkey. And control over this corridor adds another layer of complexity to the conflict, turning it into a high-stakes geopolitical chess match.
So we have historical tension, inflammatory rhetoric, and a strategic choke point that both sides want to control. Is diplomacy even possible at this point, or are we witnessing the early stages of another devastating war?
Well, it's a deeply concerning possibility. The situation is incredibly volatile, and even a minor misstep could lead to a rapid escalation of violence. Yeah, it really demands careful attention and a nuanced understanding of all the historical and geopolitical factors. I mean, simplistic solutions or knee-jerk reactions could have disastrous consequences.
You've touched on something really important there, the historical context. When Aliyev uses the term like fascist to describe Armenia, it's not just an insult, is it? It's loaded with all this historical baggage that can't be ignored.
Exactly. It evokes memories of past atrocities, including the Armenian genocide, and it can be seen as a deliberate attempt to dehumanize Armenians and justify violence against them. This kind of rhetoric is incredibly dangerous because it taps into deep-seated fears and resentments, which just makes it so much harder to find a path to peace.
Yeah. It's like he's pouring gasoline on a fire that's already been smoldering for decades. And this kind of aggressive rhetoric seems to be on the rise globally, doesn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately. We're seeing a trend toward more aggressive language in international relations. Leaders are resorting to insults and threats, even outright hate speech.
Right.
And this is partly due to the rise of social media. I think it's created a more polarized and divisive environment where extreme viewpoints are amplified. It's like everyone's just shouting at each other, and no one's really listening.
It's almost like we've lost the ability to have nuanced, respectful conversations about complex issues. Everyone's just digging in their heels, clinging to their own beliefs, and demonizing anyone who disagrees with them.
It's a worrying trend, and it's not just confined to social media either. This kind of divisive rhetoric has it's seeped into mainstream politics and media as well.
Right.
And it's making it harder to find any common ground, any consensus on the issues facing our world.
It does feel like we're living in a time of heightened anxiety and uncertainty. The pandemic, climate change, economic instability, all of these things contribute to a sense of fear and insecurity, which often manifests as anger and aggression.
Absolutely. When people are afraid, they're more likely to lash out. Look for scapegoats. Embrace simplistic solutions to complex problems.
Right.
And this is fertile ground for demagogues and extremists who prey on people's fears and insecurities.
So how do we combat this trend? How do we promote more civil and constructive dialogue in a world that seems to be getting more and more polarized and divided?
It's a complex challenge, and there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
But I think it starts with each of us. Being more mindful of our own language and our own behavior. We need to be willing to listen to opposing viewpoints, to engage in respectful debate, avoid those personal attacks, It's about recognizing that even if we disagree with someone, they still deserve our respect.
It's about remembering that at the end of the day, we're all human beings trying to navigate this complex world together. We may have different perspectives and beliefs, but we share the same planet.
Right.
The same fundamental needs.
Exactly. And if we want to address the pressing challenges facing our world, climate change, poverty, conflict, we need to find ways to work together. We need to build bridges instead of walls.
That brings us back to the war in Ukraine. We talked earlier about the human cost of this conflict and the difficulty of finding a path to peace. What can we as individuals do to help?
Well, there are a number of things. We can donate to humanitarian organizations that are providing aid to those affected by the war. We can contact our elected officials and urge them to support diplomatic efforts to end the conflict. And we can spread awareness about the situation by talking to our friends and family and sharing information online.
Yeah. It's easy to feel helpless in the face of such overwhelming tragedy. But it's important to remember that even small actions can make a difference. Every voice counts. Every act of kindness matters.
Absolutely. And sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply show up, bear witness to the suffering, and offer our support and solidarity to those who are struggling.
So we've talked about war, territorial disputes, the dangers of aggressive rhetoric. It can all feel a bit overwhelming, to be honest. Where do we go from here? What's the takeaway for our listeners?
I think the most important takeaway is that we need to stay engaged. We can't afford to tune out or just give in to despair. The challenges we face are complex, daunting even, but they're not insurmountable. We need to stay informed, stay connected, and keep working toward a better future.
You're right. It's easy to get bogged down in the negativity, especially when we're constantly bombarded with bad news. But we need to remember that there are still good things happening in the world. There are people working tirelessly to make a difference, to build bridges, to promote peace and understanding.
Exactly. And those people need our support. They need us to amplify their voices, share their stories, celebrate their successes. We need to shine a light on the people and organizations that are working to make the world a better place.
So it's not just about staying informed about the problems, it's also about seeking out and supporting the solutions. It's about finding those glimmers of hope in a world that often feels dark and uncertain.
Absolutely. And sometimes those glimmers of hope come from the most unexpected places. They come from ordinary people doing extraordinary things. They come from acts of kindness and compassion. They come from people who just refuse to give up on the dream of a better world.
Now let's circle back to that whole saga with Trump and Greenland. On the surface, it sounds like, I don't know, some kind of political satire.
Right.
But as we've been discussing, it actually reveals some deeper anxieties bubbling beneath the surface of global politics.
Yeah, you're right. While the idea of the U.S. forcefully taking Greenland is highly unlikely, the fact that it was even suggested is a sign of the times.
Yeah.
It speaks to a growing sense of nationalism and a willingness to challenge existing norms and boundaries.
And it's not just Trump. We're seeing this kind of behavior from leaders all over the world. Leaders who are willing to put their own interests above the common good, willing to use force or coercion to get what they want, willing to exploit people's fears and prejudices for their own political gain.
It's a worrying trend. Could lead to increased instability and conflict. It's a trend we need to resist with everything we've got.
So what does this all mean for Greenland? How are people there reacting to all of this?
Well, to put it mildly, they're not thrilled about being treated like some piece of real estate that could be bought and sold. Greenland has its own unique culture and identity.
Right.
And they value their autonomy. They're not interested in being pawns in some geopolitical game between superpowers.
And they've made that very clear. Back in 2019, when Trump first floated this idea, the Danish prime minister at the time, Mette Frederiksen, called it absurd.
Right. And the current government in Greenland has also rejected the idea outright. They see it as a violation of their sovereignty and a threat to their way of life.
So what's been the U.S. response to this? Has the Biden administration distanced itself from Trump's comments?
Yeah, they have.
Yeah.
Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has said that the idea of taking Greenland is obviously infeasible and not going to happen, but the damage has already been done.
Right.
Trump's comments have created this sense of distrust and unease. It'll be difficult to repair.
And it's not just about Greenland, is it?
No.
Trump's actions have damaged U.S. relations with its European allies more broadly. His America First policies, his disregard for international norms, have alienated many of America's traditional partners.
Absolutely. And that's created a void that other countries like Russia and China have been quick to fill.
Right.
They've been actively courting countries in Europe, Africa, and Asia,
Yeah.
offering them economic and military aid in exchange for political support.
So where do we go from here? What does the future hold for Greenland and the Arctic region as a whole?
Well, that's a big question. The Arctic is becoming increasingly important strategically. Climate change is opening up new shipping routes and access to resources.
Right.
This is going to lead to increased competition between nations. And it's essential that this competition remains peaceful and cooperative.
So we need to find a way to balance national interests with the need for international cooperation.
Exactly. We need to work together to ensure that the Arctic remains a zone of peace and stability.
Which brings us back to the bigger picture. The events we've discussed today, the war in Ukraine, the tensions over Greenland, the rhetoric between Armenia and Azerbaijan, they're all symptoms of a world that's becoming increasingly interconnected and complex.
Mm-hmm. And as that complexity increases, so too does the need for clear thinking, strong leadership, a commitment to diplomacy.
I completely agree. And that's something we can all contribute to, even in our own small ways, by staying informed, engaging in thoughtful dialogue, and holding our leaders accountable. We can help create a more peaceful and just world.
Beautifully said.
Well, that's all the time we have for today, but before we go, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
In a world where information travels at the speed of light and attention spans are shrinking by the minute, it's more important than ever to develop our critical thinking skills. We need to be able to sift through the noise, identify bias, and discern truth from falsehood.
I couldn't agree more. We're constantly bombarded with information from all sides.
Right.
And it's hard to know what to believe.
Exactly. So my challenge to our listeners is this. Don't just accept what you read or hear at face value. Question everything. Do your own research. Seek out diverse perspectives.
Yeah, it's about being willing to examine our own beliefs and assumptions too, right?
It's about being open to the possibility that we might be wrong, that there might be another way of seeing things. That's how we grow.
Yeah.
Individually and as a society.
Like that saying, the measure of intelligence is the ability to change. We have to be willing to let go of old beliefs and embrace new information, even if it challenges our preconceived notions.
We've covered a lot of heavy topics today, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the negativity in the world.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, I want to shift gears for a moment.
Okay.
And talk about hope. Where can we find hope in the midst of all this chaos and uncertainty?
Well, it's easy to get bogged down in the negativity, especially when we're constantly bombarded with bad news, But it's important to remember that there are still good things happening in the world. There are people working tirelessly to make a difference, to build bridges, to promote peace and understanding.
It's like that quote from Mr. Rogers. Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. Even in the darkest of times, there are always those who are working to bring light and hope into the world.
Exactly. And those people need our support.
Mm-hmm.
They need us to amplify their voices, to share their stories, to celebrate their successes. We need to shine a light on the people and organizations that are working to make the world a better place.
It's not just about being aware of the problems. It's about actively seeking out and supporting the solutions. It's about finding those glimmers of hope in a world that often feels dark and uncertain.
Absolutely. And sometimes those glimmers of hope come from the most unexpected places. They come from ordinary people doing extraordinary things. They come from acts of kindness and compassion. They come from people who just refuse to give up on the dream of a better world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a call to action. What can we do in our own lives to promote peace, understanding, and cooperation?
I think it starts with small, everyday acts of kindness and compassion. It's about reaching out to people who are different from us, listening to their stories, trying to understand their perspectives.
It's about building bridges instead of walls. It's about choosing empathy over apathy.
Exactly. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and working together to create a more just and equitable world. It's about understanding that we're all interconnected and that what affects one of us ultimately affects all of us.
And remember, even small actions can make a difference. Every act of kindness, every conversation, every effort to understand another person's point of view, it all contributes to a more peaceful and harmonious world.
Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simple listen. To really listen to what others have to say, without judgment or interruption. That's how we build empathy and understanding.
Yeah, that's what the world needs more of right now, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's the foundation for everything else.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
And remember, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep searching for those glimmers of hope in a world that often feels dark and uncertain.
Beautifully said. Until next time, keep exploring and keep learning.